displayed simultaneously. This is also part of the sanctions. Sorry to say that, but we will not be able to see each other at once as in other video conference platforms. Now, before we start, I would like to invite you all to participate in a survey and answer this very simple question. In the midst of a pandemic, should sanctions be lifted? So please feel free to submit your response. The results will be shared in the closing segment of this virtual event. So you must have that in front of your screens now. So we will, as mentioned, share the outcomes of the survey at the end of the event. So allow me now to start with very short opening remarks, because we have a dream team of speakers today. We know that the global health crisis arising from the COVID-19 pandemic is, with no doubt, the greatest public health emergency of our times, disrupting lives, livelihoods, economies. It has also emerged as the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression of 1930, reversing development gains achieved over the past decades in many of our countries, exacerbating existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. The current global economic recession is certain to go far beyond 2020 for many of our countries, especially the global South. The current pandemic, although taking place at a time when multilateralism is at attack, provides also a unique opportunity for the international community to pursue a strong, efficient, and reinvigorated multilateral system with the UN at its epicenter. We need international cooperation and solidarity in the collective response to this global crisis. The Secretary General of the UN has clearly stated that, and I quote him, "More than ever before, we need solidarity, hope, and the political will to see this crisis through together." It is precisely at this critical juncture that we need to stress the call for the immediate lifting of unilateral coercive measures, which impose grave economic, commercial, and financial burden and restrictions on the affected countries, and further constrains their ability to respond to the pandemic, including on the timely and effective procurement of medical equipment and supplies, testing, kits and treatment, protective personal equipment, and all of which are vital for treating patients and saving lives. The international community must avoid the collapse of any country's healthcare and economic system as a result of the application of these unilateral measures. Unilateral coercive measures are arbitrary, counter the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law. They affect human rights, including the human rights to life, health, and food, and prevent the full economic and social development of the peoples affected by them. Moreover, in this interconnected and interdependent world we live in, impeding medical efforts in one country heightens the risk of all of us. Ultimately, these measures affect the essential cooperation and solidarity that should prevail among nations. This call has also been consistently expressed by the Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Director of the World Health Organization, the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, the Special Rapporteur on the right to development, the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, among other United Nations high officials and experts. More than ever, governments must cooperate to revitalize economy, expand public investment, boost trade, and ensure targeted support for people and communities most affected by the COVID-19. In light of all of the above, is that we believe that today's webinar is of the utmost importance. I would like now to start by giving the floor to the permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the United Nations, His Excellency, Mr. Majid Takht Ravanchi, to deliver some brief opening remarks. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, let me thank you and the distinguished panelists for taking the time to participate in this important. That today's discussions will further enhance our understanding of the impact of UCMs on the global fight against COVID-19. From the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, that COVID-19 was not a national issue, but
we have lost the ambassador of Iran. I think that we're having some technical problems with his sound and image. Joaquin, can you guide me, please, if we continue to be okay? So while we recover sound and image of the permanent representative of Iran, I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Vasily Nebenzia, permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, to take the floor now. So, Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's a pleasure to see you again. Long time. Welcome to this meeting again. And I also welcome all colleagues who attended this event. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a co-organizer of today's event. It is hard to overestimate its importance. The whole world is facing one of the greatest emergencies. The well-being of people, social and economic development of all countries are under threat. The Russian Federation is convinced that global solidarity, multilateralism and joint efforts of all the members of the international community in the face of the pandemic are needed to overcome effectively its consequences and get on track of sustainable recovery. The particular focus of the effort should be to address the needs of developing countries, their ability to cope with COVID-19 consequences is limited, as we know. It is self-evident that unilateral coercive measures imposed without the sanctions of the Security Council are an additional burden on the developing countries, undermining their preparedness for the pandemic and the effectiveness of their response. That is why the Russian Federation, together with like-minded governments, as well as multilateral institutions, and independent politicians, economists, human rights and civil society activists, has been consistently calling to abolish such unlawful measures. This call is becoming even more important today when we see that these measures hinder access to essential healthcare services and safe, effective and affordable essential medicines, vaccines, personal protection equipment and food items. A number of Western countries appeal to increase donor base of the international development assistance to help developing countries. At the same time, they are imposing unilateral coercive measures against those countries which undermine their potential. Amid growing global economic crisis, unilateral, illegitimate and politically motivated restrictive measures are becoming increasingly extraterritorial, blocking access to financial resources and advanced technologies, including in healthcare. There is another significant adverse effect caused by such measures. Many operators are unwilling to engage in transactions related to a sanctioned country or individual, even if those are legitimate, so-called overcompliance, for fear of accidentally violating the sanctions and the related lack of economic incentives. These harmful measures are in violation of the UN Charter, including its fundamental principles of sovereignty, equality, sovereign equality of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, and friendly cooperation. They also violate other obligations under international law, undermine the right of the states to development and their progress to achieve Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. Calls to seize unilateral coercive measures are becoming louder. We support recent appeals by the UN Secretary General, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on UCMs, the WHO Director General, the Secretary General UNCTAD, to name only a few in this regard. We must promote non-discriminatory approach in providing access to virtual UN events for all member states. We expect that the UN Secretariat guarantees the use of sanction-free virtual platforms for that purpose. We have experience to the contrary, unfortunately. We are looking forward to working with the UN Special Rapporteur on UCMs and other UN organizations on the basis of the provisions of the UN General Assembly Resolution 74-200 that mandated the Secretary General to, I quote, monitor the imposition of unilateral economic measures as a means of political and economic coercion, and to study the impact of such measures on the affected countries, unquote. And I hope that our webinar today will contribute to this. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Excellency, it's also very good to see you, to see you. And I think I thank you for your opening remarks. I think we have recovered again sound and image from His Excellency Ambassador Takhrevanchi, and I give you back the floor, Excellency. You have the floor now for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very good. Very
okay. Well. Thank you. Let me thank you and the distinguished panelists for taking the time to participate in this important webinar. I'm certain that today's discussions will further enhance our understanding of the impact of UCMs on the global fight against COVID-19. From the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, it was evident that COVID-19 was not a national issue, but in fact a much larger scale global issue. The rapid spread of the virus proved that this enemy cannot be defeated without resorting to joint efforts of all countries and international organizations in a spirit of multilateralism, cooperation, and solidarity. However, as the entire world continues to work together to contain the COVID-19, we witness that the US continues to impose unilateral coercive measures, including illegal economic sanctions, on a number of countries, including those that are greatly suffering from the grave consequences of the pandemic. It is an undeniable fact that the continuation of UCMs, including illegitimate sanctions, especially during this pandemic, which has led to the consequent death of innocent people, passes the red lines of economic terrorism and health terrorism and reaches the level of a crime against humanity. The unilateral coercive measures constitute a serious obstacle to the fulfillment of countries' a fundamental right to obtain the necessary means to contain and defeat COVID-19. Given these facts, the US illegal sanctions have posed a serious threat to the Iranian people's right to health and access to essential medicines and medical equipment. The US baselessly claims that the UCMs do not cover food and medicine and medical supplies, but in reality they are, because the exclusion and deprivation of countries from international banking system deprives them of the ability to acquire them through existing commercial and financial mechanisms. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that the international community needs to come together and promote multilateralism and strengthen its solidarity to reject and eliminate any unilateral coercive measures and work together based on human values as well as moral principles to effectively control and resolve this catastrophic crisis. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Excellency. Thank you to the permanent representative of Iran to the United Nations. I immediately would like to give the floor to His Excellency Samuel Moncada, permanent representative of the Republic of Venezuela to the United Nations, to take the floor. You have the floor, Excellency. I cannot see or hear Ambassador of Venezuela. Well, so I think that perhaps we can continue now with the of speakers until we. Okay, now I see Jeffrey Sachs on screen. Oh, okay. Now I can see Ambassador Moncada. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, Madam Moderator. Allow me to express how honored Venezuela is to co-host this webinar together with Belarus, China, Cuba, Iran, Nicaragua, Russia, Syria, and Zimbabwe. Similarly, we are honored to have with us so many speakers with great expertise on their respective fields. Madam Moderator, the present crisis demands our collective, coordinated, and decisive actions as never before. But unilateral coercive measures are the exact opposite of cooperation. They do have an impact on the daily lives of the people subjected to them, particularly in the midst of a global pandemic. As a matter of fact, we are all currently witnessing the negative effect they have on human rights, how they hinder the ability of entire populations to fully realize their human right to development, to food, to health, and even to life. We are all seeing how these inhumane measures pose a clear obstacle for ensuring the well-being of our peoples, particularly of the most vulnerable sectors of our societies, and how they make it nearly impossible to have access to the international financial system or to exercise free trade for procuring basic goods and services, including medical equipment and supplies, testing kits, medications, food, and fuel. Unilateral coercive measures are illegal, and the UN General Assembly condemns them, especially when used as means of political and economic coercion against developing countries. Now, in times of pandemic, their application is far more reprehensible, as it aggravates the situation on the ground. A clear example of this is the fact that from the UN Secretary General to the Pope, from the President of the General Assembly to the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights and beyond, there is an increasing global cry for the immediate and complete lifting of the so-called sanctions. We live in an interconnected world, and in the midst of a pandemic, holding back medical efforts in a country through illegal application of these measures only magnify the risk for us all. Regrettably, their imposition continues in a systematic manner, with impunity, as they are being intensified against the dignity and life of one of mankind in 40 countries around the world, including Venezuela. This is, without a doubt, the perpetration of a crime against humanity. Consequently, we demand to those who illegally apply and promote unilateral coercive measures to urgently put political interests aside and support our joint efforts to save lives from what today should be our only enemy, the global pandemic of COVID-19. I thank you, Madam Moderator.
Phone is off. Madam Moderator, your microphone is off. You need to unmute.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I was thanking His Excellency Ambassador Moncada for his remarks, and I was suggesting that we now move to the presentations from our panelists. As mentioned, we have a dream team of panelists for this afternoon. I would start by giving the floor to Ms. Alina Duhan, UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. You have the floor, Madam. The floor is yours. There is an audio problem with our panelists, so please make sure that you have.
Well, hope everyone can hear me now. Thank you very much, Madam President. And it's an honor for me to speak today at this important and timely webinar. And I want to thank, first of all, the organizers for their efforts to organize this virtual meeting and to make it possible, despite the pandemic, differences in time zone, problems with platform access, as well as connectivity. There is no one around the world today who is not affected by the global health crisis. It can't be doubted that every single person in every part of the globe is endangered. We do already know that the virus is killing. As the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights noted in her statement of March 24, pandemic challenged the whole system of human rights, including such fundamental human rights as the right to life and the right to health. That's why the UN policy brief of April 23 identifies saving lives as the main UN priority. Unilateral sanctions exacerbate situation for those who are affected. That's why I have repeatedly called a line with the United Nations Group 77, No Aligned Movement, as well as other actors to lift or at least suspend all unilateral sanctions that obstruct the humanitarian responses of sanctioned states in order to enable their healthcare systems to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and to save lives. The guidance note issued by me on May 1st seeks to establish the set of principles of behavior as regard the mechanisms of interaction to guarantee that purchase and delivery of medicine, medical equipment, protective kits, and supplies are not affected by sanctions. It's generally agreed that the virus can only be fought in the spirit of solidarity and cooperation worldwide. That's why, while welcoming on this regard every effort of targeting states to improve humanitarian exception mechanisms, and I note here, for example, the adoptions of the European Union guidance note of May 11th, or to enable payment system, for example, via Instex, or to provide humanitarian aid, I believe that these measures are not sufficient to protect the rights of people in the targeted countries. The inputs from the targeted countries say that the effect of these measures is rather insignificant. It brings me to the question that whether the international community has failed the test of solidarity and cooperation. When we speak about humanitarian concerns, it's necessary to remember that the virus does not discriminate, but people do. The President's statement of the Human Rights Council of May 29th expresses deep concerns that the COVID-19 pandemic perpetuates existing inequalities, but unfortunately doesn't address the fact that the existing unilateral sanctions exacerbate the aforementioned calamities and discriminate thus population of targeted countries, which constitute about 20% of the UN member states. I would like to cite here just a few, not all of them, really a few of practical examples on the point. In particular, Cuba sent around 29,000 doctors around the world to fight COVID-19, but was unable to receive masks, tests, ventilators, protective kits at the humanitarian aid in March, because the US-based courier declined the order at the last minute on grounds that the regulation related to the blockade imposed against Cuba prevented it from fulfillment of the contract. Moreover, requests for emergency loans from International Monetary Fund and World Bank made by Iran, Cuba, Sudan, along with other 97 states to fight COVID-19 have been blocked by the United States. The Bank of England declined the request of Venezuela to defreeze even a part of the $1 billion in gold to fight the pandemic, even to be used by the UNDP for procurement of medicine and other humanitarian supplies. Syria is able to make 100 tests per day only because of barriers imposed by sanctions. It can't buy the US-produced software for medical equipment necessary to fight COVID-19. Nearly 300,000 of Afghans settled in Iran for dozens of years already have returned back from Iran since January 1st because of the worsening economic situation exacerbated by the pandemic. Online services are prevented to be used by actors from targeted countries, not only for trade, but rather for non-commercial activity. In particular, Zoom service agreement directly prescribes that it can't be used by subjects registered in Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and other states targeted in accordance with the US legislation, even to establish virtual meetings and webinars similar to the one we have today, to get inter alia education and training for doctors and implement telemedicine services. This challenging time provides the picturesque example that the very notion, grounds, purposes, targets, subjects, mechanism, and means of unilateral sanctions are drastically changing and expanding in the absence of consensus about their application and relevant legal grounds. The pandemic has clearly demonstrated how deadly unilateral sanctions can be. This dramatic challenge provides us with a good opportunity to recall what the world's cooperation, solidarity, legality mean, and to start looking for the consensus to establish the legal framework for any unilateral action. Every day brings us some new knowledge about the coronavirus, as well as about the impact of unilateral sanctions on human rights in the course of pandemic. As far as my report to the UN General Assembly will be devoted directly to this issue, I would use a chance to invite states, international organizations, and any representatives of civil society to submit information in accordance with the questionnaire on the webpage of the mandate. As far as the call for contributions is still open until June 15, and to thank those delegations and organizations which have already forwarded their inputs. I believe that it's a good chance for those who are concerned to be heard. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Well, I have to thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Lujan, for not only for your statement, but for the work that you are doing of high quality and a very thorough work. I now give the floor. I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, CSDN. You have the floor, Excellency. It's great to see you, ECU. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and Madam President, it is wonderful to see you, and thank you for presiding over such an important meeting today. We're dealing with policies of great cruelty. This, I think, is very clear. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a leadership in the United States of great cruelty. So the moral complaints are going to fall on deaf ears. You see, even inside the United States, we have 107,000 deaths now. We have a president who does not care about American deaths. So he will not care about the deaths of countries that are online today. We have a president who has done the shocking act beyond barbarity of cutting off funding for the World Health Organization at the height of the worst global pandemic in a century. It is absolutely unimaginable, in fact. We have a president who shot protesters in front of the White House with rubber bullets and tear gas so that he could show how tough he is to walk across the street. In other words, we're dealing with a kind of vulgarity that we have not experienced in US political leadership. And that's saying a lot, unfortunately, because there's been very many instances of bad leadership, but we have never experienced what we are experiencing with Trump and this administration. So I think that it is very clear that we're not debating decency. We don't have decency in power right now. We have a great danger, not only to the world, but to Americans themselves, who are dying in very large numbers because of this pandemic and the complete failure of the government of the United States to address the pandemic, even at home, much less abroad. So I think we should discuss practicalities also, because I do not believe that the problems that are being discussed today lack solutions, practical solutions. You know, the United States is one country out of 193 in the UN. It's got about 4.2% of the world population. So the other 192 countries have 95.8% of the world population. And when we're talking about unilateral coercive measures, we're talking about the US, which is a small part of the world, after all. Even the US economy at this point is about 14% of the world economy, measured in purchasing power terms. So I would say that 85% or more of the world economy is outside of the US unilateralism. So it is very peculiar that one country, led by a very unstable, psychologically unstable person, should be dictating the ability of Iran to get medical supplies, or Cuba to get personal protective equipment, or Venezuela to be able to secure hospital equipment. It just does not make sense that this should even be practically possible. We're not really talking about the US sanctions per se. They're going to persist as long as Trump is there. We're talking about the extraterritoriality of the US sanctions, the fact that other countries follow along. My thesis is that most of the world does not want to follow along these rather barbaric policies, these cruel policies. Most of the world does not admire the cruelty of the US leadership. The reason countries follow along is that they fear the financial sanctions, the sting of the United States. If a transaction then is deemed to be in violation of these extraterritorial sanctions, and so the company gets punished, even if it's a French company or an Italian company or a German company or a Chinese company and so forth. This is the real issue that we're talking about, not the US sanctions. Those are cruel, nasty, and not going away. But it is the extraterritoriality that is rather extraordinary. Now, where does this come from? It basically comes from the US dollar in the international banking system, that most transactions still are cleared in US dollars. And therefore, there is some indirect claim banks won't handle these transactions. Companies that have the US market are scared of retaliation. The US has even called for extradition of CEOs of companies that violated US extraterritorial sanctions, and Canada shockingly arrested one of these CEOs on the basis of this extraterritorial claim. But what I do recommend as a very practical matter is to create new entities, not dealing in dollars, but dealing in renminbi, in rubles, in euros, that are not tied to US companies or US banks, and that can clear transactions with Venezuela or Iran or other countries under US unilateral sanction. I'm not talking about UN approved sanctions. I'm talking about single US sanctions, so that these entities are not subject to loss of the US market because they don't care about the US market. They're not desiring the US market. They're created to avoid the US market. So I think what is really needed, in addition to the expressions of dismay, which obviously I share in every way, is practicalities, so that a country that is 4% of the world and 14 to 15% of the world economy does not dictate for the other 96% of the world population decisions about what should be made. But this requires building some not such complex institutions, by the way. And we have international currencies. We have ways to make settlements outside of dollars that don't have to clear through US banks. And so I'd be very happy as a specialist in international finance to brainstorm on how this can be done, because the prerogative of the dollar should be based on honesty, trust, and obeying international law. The role of the dollar should not be the occasion of naked power. It should not be the instrument of naked power. The reason that the dollar became a currency of settlement and a currency of payment was the size and stability and role of the US economy, not naked power. And it now, with the US much shrunken in global role, there still is a legacy of clearing in dollars, and the US controls SWIFT, in effect, the bank payment system. But it's not so hard to work around this. It really is not some fundamental obstacle. And even if it is state to state management, after all, most of Venezuela's exports are oil, and oil is a global commodity that can be traded, and similarly with Iran. So finding a mechanism with the governments of Russia and China and the EU, I hope, and other governments that don't want to see this abusive kind of measure during a period of a global pandemic, after all, although I think it doesn't belong anytime, but especially now. It seems to me that this should really be a very practical matter of finding a new institutional way to clear payments or to make trades that do not depend on the reach of the US banking system. And I do not see any fundamental obstacles in trading oil for many, many things in this world through new institutional mechanisms. I would also say, of course, let us use diplomatic means to express the outrage, the violation of international law. I would hope that this would go to the Security Council, and when it is vetoed in the Security Council, to take it to the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace resolution, because this kind of abuse should be decided by the whole body of the United Nations, and we have a mechanism for the world as a whole to speak. And at the height of a pandemic, which is extraordinarily serious, the world should speak with one voice but one. I'm not too optimistic about the voice of the United States until we solve this, but I am in belief that almost the rest of the world, except for a few countries that the US will terrify, will speak with the voice of decency. So those are the short remarks that I wanted to share, and I very much appreciate the chance to share them with you and to, if in any way, be helpful at the practicalities of getting trade going that just obviates the US banking system. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Sachs, and also for your metaphor, which is very well taken as UCMs as policies of great cruelty. but also in offering very practical outlets, starting by a new system of payments, international payments for trade, and and of course the diplomatic front that we should not abandon. Thank you so much for your remarks, Professor Sachs. We will get back to you later also for questions, answers, and closing remarks. I now have the privilege to give the floor to Dr. Richard Kozel-Wright, Director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD. So you have the floor, Dr. Kozel-Wright. It's also, I'm delighted to see you, to ECU. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda, and very nice to see you again. Thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me to give some remarks. It's going to be very difficult after Elena and Jeff to say anything very original. I think they've covered a lot of the work. I don't want to talk about UNCTAD's work on the COVID-19 itself. We've been very ahead of the curve in anticipating the very, very serious damage that the crisis has and will cause to developing countries, and the need for a very concerted multilateral response to mitigate the damage. Unfortunately, at least to date, that multilateral response has not really been forthcoming in terms of the scale that we think is needed to deal with the problems. On top of that, I mean, we are fully aware of the damage to livelihoods and to lives that comes from economic sanctions. This is an old concern of UNCTAD. It hits output, it raises poverty, they lead to greater inequality, they damage trade, they reduce government revenues, all of which, in the context of the crisis we are facing, are not only illegal, as we know, as Elena pointed out, but they're also very completely unacceptable. Nor do, ironically, they don't really work in terms of achieving their outcome. These kinds of sanctions don't really work in terms of an effective tool to change things. But what is particularly concerning is the point I think that Jeff made, is despite that, despite the damage they cause, despite their ineffectiveness, they have become much more potent tools of international diplomacy, inverted commas, over the course of the last 2 to 3 decades, largely because of their influence on financial relationships and financial flows. And as Jeff pointed out, we don't, when it comes to the key levers of hegemonic power, we do not live in a multipolar world. Money and guns are the ingredients of hegemonic power, and there is only one country that continues to dominate in terms of both money and guns. The dollar Wall Street nexus is stronger than it ever was. And I don't think it's just about cross-border banking transactions, although a huge quantity of those take place in dollars. The share of foreign reserves that countries keep, very large dollar amount is held in dollars. The share of dollar-denominated external debt is extremely high, particularly for developing countries. The share of SWIFT transactions, as Jeff pointed out, again, dollar-denominated. Commodity trades are completely take place in dollars. And of course, at the end of the day, the United States has veto power in the IMF as well. So, I mean, the hold that the dollar Wall Street nexus has over the international economy is extremely powerful, and it's because of that financial institutions become de facto enforcers of the sanctions of a single country, given that the threat of being classified as a violator leads to financial and reputational risk, and these organizations do not want to lose the opportunities that they have in this dollarized world. I agree with Jeff that there's got to be alternatives. UNCTAD has long held out that South-South cooperation offers alternatives to circumvent some of these relationships. And it is true that over the last 2 decades, certainly in the area of finance, new South-South financial relationships, the rise of the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a number of the Chiang Mai Initiative. There's a skeletal there of opportunities to build on, I think, as Jeff suggested, to circumvent that. But I don't think we should underestimate the power of this Wall Street dollar nexus and the importance, if we are to recover multilateralism, to find alternatives to that. I think, at least in the work we've done in UNCTAD, this is critical. I think it's also important to emphasize that the use of unilateral fact-sanctions is clearly a threat to multilateralism at the moment that we need more multilateralism. And it essentially undermines the two fundamental pillars of any governance structure. It undermines the sense of justice and it undermines the sense of trust. These are classic pillars of governance that go back to the work of Adam Smith. And at a time we do need to rebuild multilateralism, the presence of unilateral sanctions is a real open wound on the actions of the international economy. And it's funny, and I'll finish on this remark, I think, although, and I agree with Jeff about the current administration, although in a funny way, sanctions are anti-American. That's a funny thing. When you look at the people who designed the original multilateral system, people like Morgenthau, the US Treasury Secretary at the time of Bretton Woods, they were very overtly opposed to the use of bullying, what they called bullying in international economic affairs, which they understood would have damaging consequences for the workings of a effective and efficient multilateral system. So in a funny way, let me just read a quote. I'll read a quote from Morgenthau, actually, by way of concluding. When Morgenthau had to defend the Bretton Woods Agreement to the US House at the Banking and Currency Committee, what I think is now the Financial Services Committee in the US Senate. And he went there to defend it because he thought this was rightly a big step forward for international cooperation and coordination. And he made the usual defenses that we had to control footloose capital and speculative capital flows. We haven't done very well on that front in recent years, but that was central to the original design. We needed to make sure that there would be no beggar thy neighbor policies. We needed to make sure that there would be enough policy space for developing countries and advanced economies to be able to undertake the policies they needed to do. But he was very explicit that one of the strengths of the multilateral system was that it would end what he called bullying, what Morgenthau called bullying. And he said, and I'll just quote this because I think it's a powerful quote that just kind of underscores the extent to which, as Jeff pointed out, the current administration has lost sense of its own roots, as well as being opposed to contemporary political discourse. Morgenthau said in 1945, when he was defending this agreement, that power politics, in the sense of bullying of small nations by big ones and of weak ones by powerful ones, has become a term of reproach in the world. The United Nations hopes to abolish it from the earth. Obviously not very successful there, but that was the hope. But power economics may be just as dangerous, for it is not the root, if it is not the root of all evil in international affairs, it is at the very least a frequent cause of conflict. So I think it's good to go back to some of the original designers of Bretton Woods to worry about how far we've deviated from the original design, and to think, I think, very hard about the need, as Jeff said, to find ways to circumvent the dominance of the dollar as not only an international economic tool, but sadly a very destructive international political tool as well. So thank you very much, Marie Fernanda.
We have to thank you for excellent remarks, Dr. Kozel-Wright. And yes, indeed, UCMs are ineffective, not only that they are illegal and against international law, but they're ineffective. They hurt the right to development and the right to life currently for countries affected. And we understand loud and clear, the money and guns power, but also the potential to think creatively about how to de-dollarize, in a way, the economy, especially strengthening the South-South brotherhood and cooperation opportunities, and of course the irreplaceable role of a strong, vital multilateral system. And we, I think, all agree that UCMs are still an open wound in our multilateral architecture. So thank you very, very much. I now have the privilege to give the floor to Mr. Dan Kovalik, Human Rights and Labor Attorney. You have the floor, Mr. Kovalik. You have your microphone is muted, so please unmute your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to all the missions that organized this event. I'm very honored to be here today. I'd like to echo some of the things that my colleague said. I think that Jeffrey was right on the money when he talked about the disgraceful fact that the U.S. has just backed out of the World Health Organization. This follows, of course, the defunding of the UN High Commission for Refugees that has been supporting Palestine. And, of course, the U.S. is backing out of the Human Rights Council. All of these things have happened in the last couple of years, and it is shameful. And when we talk about unilateral sanctions, as Jeffrey said, we are talking about the United States. And I believe what we need to call these sanctions what they are, and they amount to war crimes because they are targeting the civilian populations of these countries intentionally trying to cause misery for these people, intentionally trying to cause deaths. In fact, one UN expert, Dr. Alfred de Zayas, has said that some of these sanctions, and he was especially mentioning those against Venezuela, may rise to the level of genocide. And I would agree with that. And I would agree that, therefore, in addition to the things said that, we need to find ways to get off the US dollar to be able to circumvent these sanctions, we need to find a way for international law to be applied to the powerful, to the United States in particular. Right now, Venezuela has a case against the U.S. before the International Criminal Court. It's trying to get the International Criminal Court to act against the U.S. because of its sanctions. We need to find a way for that to happen. The ICC cannot just be a tool to go after African nations. Let's, be honest here. The law has to work for the strong or against the strong as much as against the weak. And I do think, again, echoing Mr. Sachs, that the Unifying for Peace Resolution, General Assembly Resolution 377, may be a way to do that, given the toll that these sanctions are taking. And let me talk a little bit about that specifically. And by the way, I also want to mention some of these sanctions, and some of the most deadly ones happen to be also UN sanctions. And I think we need to be very upfront about that, particularly those that are being imposed against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and have been in place since 2016. Those are particularly deadly sanctions. I'd like to refer, and since no one has mentioned the DPRK yet, to a very good study that was done, I'm sure many of you know about it, in October of 2019, called The Human Cost and Gendered Impact of Sanctions on North Korea. And they mentioned that both the U.S. sanctions and the UN sanctions are putting millions of people in North Korea at grave risk, including an estimated 9.7 million people in the DPRK who do not have access to safely managed drinking water due to these sanctions. How can you not have access to drinking waters during a pandemic? This is a gross violation of human rights, and those sanctions must be lifted against the DPRK. By the way, this same report, which again, as the title suggests, concludes that these sanctions disproportionately hurt women and children, concludes that in 2018 alone, nearly 4,000 Koreans died in the DPRK due to these sanctions. Many of these women, many of these children. Again, those sanctions must be lifted. In terms of the sanctions against Venezuela, I wanted to mention, first of all, ironically, the report that Jeffrey Sachs himself did, but did not mention, along with Mark Weisbrod. It's put out by the Center for Economic Policy Research, or CEPR, which estimated in 1 year alone, between 2017 and 2018, U.S. sanctions have killed 40,000 Venezuelans by denying them medicines such as insulin, HIV medicines, chemotherapy medicines, dialysis equipment, and food. Again, according to Dr. Alfred de Zayas, he estimates that by now at least 100,000 Venezuelans have died due to these sanctions. And I think that that figure is very much in keeping with Jeffrey Sachs's conclusions. He believed that in the year following the 2017 to 2018 year, even more than 40,000 Venezuelans would die once we have those figures. So I think that 100,000 figure, probably very conservative. Venezuela has been denied its request for $5 billion in IMF loans to fight the pandemic. Again, the U.S. was crucial in doing that. Iran has a request before the IMF for $5 million for the pandemic. Those requests should be granted. But again, the U.S. is preventing that from happening. In Venezuela, also, it needs to be pointed out that right now millions of people are being denied access to water as well in Venezuela due to the sanctions. And why? Because the pumps that they rely on to pump the water, they cannot get replacement parts for because of the sanctions. They are also, of course, being denied the ability to convert oil into gasoline, and they power a lot of their water supply with gasoline. So again, during a pandemic, you have millions of people in Venezuela, millions of people in Korea who cannot get access to fresh water when we're telling everyone to wash their hands. It's quite incredible. Meanwhile, we also, again, it was mentioned, I forget by whom, that, right now the United Kingdom, the Bank of England, has $1.5 billion, actually, with the increase in gold during this pandemic. It's probably now worth about $3 billion of gold, Venezuelan gold reserves that it will not give back to Venezuela to deal with this pandemic. And what we're talking about in terms of these sanctions, frankly, just becomes nothing but old-time imperial theft. The U.S. seized Citgo from Venezuela. That was Venezuela's single largest source of revenue. It just stole it and seized billions of dollars from Venezuela. That Citgo's now gone. It's being sold to a Canadian mining company. This type of lawless activity just simply cannot be permitted. The UN needs to find a way to hold the U.S. accountable for these actions through the International Criminal Court, through the Uniting for Peace General Assembly Resolution 377. I just want to mention a couple other facts that need to be pointed out in terms of Iran, for example, which, by the way, I applaud Iran for evading the U.S. blockade and sending important fuel to Venezuela. That was a great act of solidarity. But meanwhile, Iran is suffering greatly due to U.S. imposed sanctions. It is estimated that possibly between 250,000 and 500,000 Iranians will die from the virus in the next 5 months, possibly as many as 1.5 million Iranians. And again, many of these deaths are preventable, but will occur because of the sanctions, which are preventing Iran from receiving ventilator equipment and increasing its intensive care capacity. I have to mention Nicaragua, which is under the very strict financial sanctions imposed under the NICA Act, which is preventing Nicaragua from obtaining important financial support. Financial support which, by the way, the World Court or the World Bank and IMF said Nicaragua have been using for important social programs, for fighting poverty, for fighting extreme poverty, and now Nicaragua is being denied that. So again, in conclusion, I just want to say that what we're looking at with these sanctions is a form of war crimes, certainly terrorism, because these are acts committed against the civilian population to create a political end, many times trying to, of course, effectuate regime change, and may even constitute genocide. Given that, the UN has the power to act under the Uniting for Peace resolution. The International Criminal Court has the power to act. It must act, because it's not enough simply to say, hey, we're going to evade the sanctions. The U.S. is simply too powerful, and we have to find a way for international law to apply to everyone equally. And I thank you very much and look forward to questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kowalik, for your statement, for mentioning, that UCMs can be seen as war crimes since they target innocent civilians. They have caused thousands of deaths in the countries affected, and that we should use international architecture that we have in hand, such as the ICC and Resolution 377, Uniting for Peace, to bring this under the consideration of the General Assembly. Thank you, Dr. Kowalik. I now have the privilege to give the floor to Professor Carlos Correa. Carlos Correa is the Executive Director of the South Center. You have the floor, Professor Correa. So apparently we have some technical problems with Professor Correa, or shall we? Well, while we recover Professor Correa, let me now go to our next speaker. It would be Melik Ozden. He's the director of the Europe Third World Center, CETIM. He has the floor. It's very good to see you again, dear Melik. You have the floor.
Many thanks, Madam President. Your Excellencies, dear colleague. First of all, let me thank the organizers for the invitation to this extremely important discussion. I hope my input on the subject matter will be useful for our collective struggle to abolish UCMs. Most of the sanctions in force today are imposed unilaterally by the US and followed by its close allies, such as the European Union. As we all know, economic sanctions and embargoes have disastrous consequences. A big issue raised by such measures is that even if they are unilateral, when applied, they become de facto multilateral. In particular, US decision on UCMs purport to apply also extraterritorially, as the US threatens third countries and all business enterprises with adverse consequences in case of no compliance. From a legal point of view, UCMs also have adverse effect on the rule of law as, first, they violate current international law, in particular international human rights and humanitarian law. Second, they deny the right of people to self-determination and deprive them more often than not of their own means of subsistence. Third, they violate the equal sovereignty of state and create a major obstacle for the targeted state to honor their human rights commitment towards their citizens. In other words, illegal and illegitimate measures compel the states that are victims of such coercive measures, and the third states compelled to impose secondary sanctions to violate human rights against their will. What should and could be done in such a situation? First of all, the former and late Special Rapporteur on UCMs called for the drafting of a UN declaration on this issue, which, among many other measures, would reserve to the Security Council the exclusive right to impose such measures and calls for the early removal of all existing ones. I hereby call upon UN member states to follow this recommendation and advocate in this sense. Secondly, the UN General Assembly could refer specific case to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. States victims of UCMs and third states concerned could also refer the matter to this court as Iran did 2 years ago. Furthermore, states and their populations victims of UCMs and third states concerned individually or collectively can submit complaint to the UN treaty bodies for no compliance with international human rights law. Moreover, as stated recently by Professor de Zayas, UCMs entail civil and criminal responsibility, and as such, the International Criminal Court must condemn those practices as crime against humanity under Article 7 of the Rome Statute. Additionally, individually and collectively, states could also take action at the national and regional levels. They can adopt national laws such as blocking statutes and common positions in regional fora prohibiting UCMs. They can also cooperate with states victims of UCMs so as to loosen the stranglehold of the blockade and alleviate the suffering of the victimized populations. Solidarity acts taken by some states during the corona crisis provide examples to this effect. Of course, it takes courage and political will on the part of states to show such solidarity. However, we are well aware that the success of these steps will not be enough in itself. The big question is how to ensure that the world's big powers respect the decision of the UN bodies condemning UCMs. As we all know, the US is using and ignoring international law as it pleases. For some years now, the US have been attacking the international multilateral system, especially the UN and its special agencies, with the aim to destroy it because they are not under its total control. During the pandemic, it has attacked the World Health Organization and blocked the supply of medicines and medical equipment for the countries under UCMs. This situation is highly problematic, not only for the public health policy, but also for the promotion of international cooperation in good faith. This is why, despite this major difficulty, it's worth taking the steps mentioned above to demonstrate the illegality of UCMs and to strengthen respect for legality of the international level. The member states of the UN must defend the multilateral system and fight not only the US attacks against it, but also the private interest capture. Madam President, good to see you. Your Excellency, dear colleague, I thank you for your attention.
Well, we thank you. We thank you for a very comprehensive statement. Melik Ozden, Director of the Europe Third World Center, CETIM, and thank you for reminding us all the tools that we have in hand, not only the special procedures, but the International Court of Justice, the UN General Assembly and the Uniting for Peace resolution, and we can take, all these instruments together with international solidarity, advocacy, stronger South-South cooperation mechanisms to face UCMs. So thank you very much, Mr. Austin. It was great to see you again. Now we have with us Professor Carlos Correa. It's such a delight to see you, Professor Correa. He's the Executive Director of the South Center and does not need further introduction. It is a privilege to have you among us this morning. You have the floor, Professor Correa.
Fernanda, it's nice to see you again virtually. Thank you very much for inviting the South Center to participate in this important webinar on such an important issue. Let me start by telling a short story. The South Center submits every year to the Secretary General of the United Nations a report in relation to the resolution which is adopted also every year. It has been this for 28 years in relation to the US embargo against Cuba. And in this report, the South Center, this was done in March, of access by the Cuban citizens to medical equipment and medicines. And then this report indicates that MediCuba, which is the company that deals with exportation and importation of these products in Cuba, requested 50 US companies to supply inputs for biotech developments, to supply drugs for fighting cancer, to supply equipment, including some prostheses, and then apply. And a few of them just say, we are not authorized to sell. So this was the situation pre-COVID-19. Of course, this situation is very much enhanced, as it was mentioned before by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, due to the extraterritorial application of the US law, which means that not only companies which are located in the US may be reached by the sanctions, or they are unable or unwilling to provide, in which they are suffering these unilateral coercive measures, but this also applies to companies from other jurisdictions, which is an issue that really is such a major violation to international law. This has already been mentioned. But then this situation explains what happened before COVID-19. COVID-19 has only exacerbated this problem, because it's not only that it has been difficult to get supplies. As you know, many countries impose export bans. This problem has been actually exacerbated. But then when it is possible to get a supplier who is willing to provide these products to a country which is victim of these sanctions, then the problem is that payment cannot be made. So it is the first place difficult to get a supplier, because so many just are reluctant or willing to make the provision of the required equipment or products. But in addition to this issue of the dominance of the United States, of the payment system, this and also Richard have mentioned this, I think is an issue only the South Center as an intergovernmental organization of developing countries is very much interested working on, because this is a reflection of the past dominance of the United States. This is an extinguishing dominant power to some extent. And I hope that November elections in United States will show that, Jeffrey, that you can choose a different president, different leadership. But then this is the reality. If it is possible to get of the dominance of the United States. So I think there is every reason, and I'm very happy this issue was raised, every reason for a coalition of countries to be established in order to develop alternative systems of payment. So this is the most unjust and incredible legacy of a period of history that we need to put an end to, on the basis of South-South cooperation, on the basis of developing, was suggested, a new institution. I agree this shouldn't be so difficult. egregious, so grave in terms of dominance of any financial transaction which is in dollar, that I think there is an urgency to do that. So let me just then agree with all the comments which were made about the violation of international law by these unilateral coercive measures. There is no doubt about this. So many principles are violated. This is a real gross violation. It's the principle for non-interference, a principle of self-determination, the principle of cooperation, which is also enshrined in the UN Charter, the principle of solidarity and in the Human Rights Code. So many principles are actually violated that they actually deprive these unilateral coercive sanctions, actually deprive international law from any value of justice. So how can we train our young lawyers and professionals in international law and convince them on principle of justice when these unilateral measures are allowed? And then there are some conversations going on about a moratorium, about some mitigation of unilateral coercive measures on the basis of caps, for instance, to the measures, on the basis of widening exceptions, in particular for humanitarian aid, on the basis of selective delisting. But if this is undertaken, I think it's very important to emphasize that implicitly or explicitly mean a recognition of the legitimacy of these measures, which are fully illegal under the international system. So these conversations may be helpful to mitigate this very negative, brutal impact of COVID-19. But in our opinion, in no case, this should mean that the legitimacy of these measures is recognized. So these measures are not only illegal, illegitimate, they are foolish, in particular in the context of COVID-19. That this pandemic is a global problem, so you need a global solution. So if you are able to treat people in a large part of the world, but you are not able to treat people in the countries which are victims of the measure, which represent 1/3 of the global population, the pandemic will not go, will be there. So it is foolish, really, to think that you can keep these measures in such a way, it was already mentioned, or treatment to people who are suffering that. So this is a requirement for the world as a whole to find the solution. It has been stated in so many places by the UN Secretary General, who has talked on the concept of global public goods for technologies relating to COVID-19. So it's a very important concept that we need to implement in a serious manner. But this means that those who are pushing for these policies do not understand actually the characteristic of a pandemic. Those who, as it was mentioned, they're just negating the very importance of an international organization to deal with it, which should be empowered, should be strengthened at this time, not weakened, as it seems to be, as is clear, the objective of the United States government. So just to conclude, let me express also the recognition of the South Center for the work which is being done by the Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, although she has been appointed work, and the South Center is very much interested and really committed to continue working on this area, and we are interested in connecting more and participating more in these activities. By the way, I should mention that the former Special Rapporteur on this issue, Ambassador Idris Jazairi, was one of the distinguished members of the board of the South Center. So the South Center has known about this issue, and then we are very much interested in cooperating. And there is a need to have really support also the idea. A UN declaration is necessary, and in fact, Ambassador Jazairi worked on a draft declaration on unilateral coercive measures and the rule of law. So the title itself is very telling. But in addition to this, we really need to take very practical measures in order to prevent these measures to harm the countries and such a big part of the population as they do today. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Maria Fernanda.
Well, we have to thank you, Professor Correa, not only for your thought-provoking remarks, but for the incredible work that the South Center is doing and has done in the past with the reports to the Secretary General regarding the blockade against Cuba, but also for strengthening, the idea of using the multilateral system, the mechanisms that we have in hand. The idea of the UN Declaration on UCMs, but also perhaps more like short-term responses, which do not imply acknowledging UCMs as legitimate, but the ongoing initiatives of selective delisting, potential moratorium, mitigation measures that do not solve the problem as a whole, but of course, perhaps they ease the pain of the current situation regarding the pandemic, and also for subscribing the idea of being creative about alternative payment systems and mechanisms and strengthening South-South cooperation. So thank you very much for your remarks, Professor Correa. The floor, I have to say that we are running a little bit, out of time. The floor is open for questions and comments. And given the time constraints, delegations that will be delivering their remarks may wish to limit their statements to 3 minutes. Those interested in posing questions to the panelists can either type them directly in the chat box or signal their intention to take the floor. And please remember to indicate your delegation and title. If you're actually taking the floor, you will be signaled on when to activate your camera or microphone so you can participate in the segment of the webinar. I now have the privilege to give the floor to His Excellency Paul Oquist Kelly, Minister and Private Secretary of National Policies of the Republic of Nicaragua. Excellency Paul Oquist Kelly, you have the floor.
Madam President, un gran abrazo. In 2020, all of the states of the world simultaneously.
We have Minister Oquist. We have a sound problem. I think that you need to raise the volume because we have difficulties hearing you.
Madam President, un gran abrazo. In 2020, all of the states of the world simultaneously confront the COVID-19 pandemic, inequality, the Great Depression 2020, and instability. Not all, but a growing number of states also suffer additionally from illegal unilateral coercive measures. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused a public health crisis and a crisis in healthcare systems while generating global viral fear. Growing inequality in 2020 is illustrated by Jeff Bezos of Amazon earning $29 billion in 3 months, while 40 million U.S. workers became unemployed in the same 3 months. The Great Depression 2020 began in the United States when 25% of the labor force became unemployed and the middle class of small businesses massively went bankrupt. They cannot pay their rent or mortgage, causing a housing crisis, or the minimum payment of your overextended credit cards or car payments, causing a financial crisis, while politicians seeking solutions to spending can generate fiscal and monetary crises. The instability is also visible in the United States. African Americans had an unemployment rate of 6% in February, while in April it rose to 16.7%. Confidence in the future is at rock bottom. The centuries-long and periodic killing of blacks by authorities has become unbearable, as is institutionalized racism of police, prosecutors, coroners, judges, juries, wardens. Systematic injustice. The countries of the world do not submit to U.S. impositions, that self-determine their economic, social, political, and cultural systems, and that defend their sovereignty and independence, as well as rule-based multilateralism, equality of states, and non-interference in internal affairs, are also victims of systemic injustice. The legal measures affect their capacity to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. The IPCC goal of a zero net emission society by 2050, and to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. The countries affected have population of over 2 billion people, with the poor, women, children, and minorities being the most affected, as always. The 6th stage of imperialism, full-spectrum dominance, includes illegal unilateral coercive measures. The United States applies them with the aggravating circumstances of claiming extraterritoriality for which laws and administrative measures without judicial recourse, or not recognizing international law in its own legal system. Imperial arrogance goes so far as to criminalize third parties for not abiding by their illegal measures. By refusing to lift or even to suspend its illegal measures during the COVID-19 pandemic, as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has demanded, by this, the aggression against our people is raised to the category described in the Statute of the International Criminal Court, Article 7, Paragraph 1, little k, which reads, and I quote, other inhumane acts of a similar character intentionally causing great or suffering or serious injury to body or to mental and physical health. End of quote. This is a literal of the legal definition of crimes against humanity. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Minister Alquist-Kelly, for your remarks. Thank you for bringing, refreshing our memories, for bringing history to this conversation, so we don't make the same mistakes, but also for reiterating the fact that UCMs can be seen as a war crime and should be dealt with using the mechanisms established by the International Court of Justice and the multilateral architecture. So thank you very much, Minister Paul Alquist-Kelly from Nicaragua. I would like now to give the floor to Ms. Petronella Nyagura, a Deputy Permanent Representative of the Republic of Zimbabwe to the United Nations. You have the floor, Excellency. I don't see Ms. Nyagura, so I will just go straight to our next speaker, which is Mr. Artizom Tozik, Deputy Permanent Representative of the, oh no, here we have Nyagura. It's so good to see you. Excellent. You have the floor. She's the Deputy Permanent Representative of Zimbabwe to the United Nations. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Excellencies and distinguished colleagues, allow me to join others in expressing our gratitude to our distinguished panelists for graciously accepting to share their valuable insights and practical suggestions on a subject which has become very pertinent during this difficult time, a time when we are faced with an unprecedented crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic. Humanity is at a crossroads, facing a global challenge of gigantic proportions as a result of the multiple and devastating impacts of the pandemic. In the case of Zimbabwe, the situation is aggravated by the debilitating unilateral coercive measures imposed upon us by some Western powers. Our efforts in the fight against the pandemic have been hampered by the sanctions and have limited our capacity to import test kits, medical supplies, and protective equipment, preventing the further spread of the coronavirus and save precious lives. Ladies and gentlemen, these punitive measures imposed on us as punishment for reclaiming our land are illegal, unjust, and go against the grain of civilized international relations as espoused in the Charter of the United Nations. Africa has rejected these sanctions, demanding for their immediate removal. SADC has also adopted a principled stance on this issue. We therefore thank our brothers and sisters in the SADC region and on the African continent for standing with us against these heinous measures, which have no place in modern day society. This meeting could not have been convened at a more opportune time when the pandemic has amplified the relevance and agency of the calls to have sanctions imposed on our countries lifted. Zimbabwe therefore welcomes the calls by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the WHO Director General Dr. Tedros, and the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, among others, to waive sanctions against countries around the world as an essential part of the global effort to contain the pandemic, to allow countries like Zimbabwe to be able to access essential supplies, including basic foodstuffs and medical supplies. Global polarization at this critical moment will not help humanity. Zimbabwe, Africa, and indeed the rest of the world need solidarity more than ever to help support the vulnerable. Sanctions are a huge barrier to the realization of the development of Zimbabwe and those countries under the yoke of these unilateral coercive measures. His Excellency President E.D. Mnangagwa, during the recently held NAM Summit on the COVID pandemic, underscored that, and I quote, "When the world is confronted by immense challenges, such as those caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, global solidarity becomes an obligation and ceases to be an option." Zimbabwe therefore reaffirms its support for the Secretary General's call for global solidarity in the fight against this scourge. Notwithstanding the challenges which are compounded by the effects of the arbitrary measures, the government of Zimbabwe, under the leadership of President E.D. Mnangagwa, has put in place a raft of measures aimed at curtailing the spread of COVID-19, including scaling up social protection, such as cash transfer for COVID-19 relief and provision of basic foodstuffs to the vulnerable. An 18 billion Zimbabwe dollar economic recovery stimulus package has also been launched to address the needs of small-scale industry and strengthen health systems. Despite these efforts, Madam Chair, the debilitating illegal sanctions and so-called targeted measures imposed by some Western countries have made it extremely difficult for Zimbabwe to adequately respond to the socio-economic impacts of the pandemic. These punitive and economic sanctions are also hindering economic recovery efforts, thereby causing untold suffering on innocent civilians, especially women and children, the youth, the aged, and people living with disabilities. It is pertinent to note that long before the pandemic, Zimbabwe was already reeling under the so-called targeted measures with devastating effects on every sector of the economy. Given the far-reaching socio-economic impacts of the pandemic, we unequivocally demand the immediate lifting of these illegal and unjustified sanctions in the spirit of leaving no one behind. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank you, Ms. Nyagura, for your statement and for your call to international solidarity, a strong multilateral response, and also South-South, greater South-South cooperation, and we appreciate also the response capacity also of Zimbabwe, of your own country. I now have the privilege to give the floor to Mr. Artisom Tozik, Deputy Permanent Representative of Belarus to the United Nations, reminding ourselves that we are far behind of time, and there is a list of speakers that is countries that are requesting the floor, and some questions that we need to respond before we give back the floor to our speakers. So Mr. Tozik, DPR of Belarus, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since we have already entered into the Q&A segment of our meeting, I will try to limit my statement to some short comments, and of course, I'll try to raise some questions for future discussion. Well, let me first of all begin by extending our high appreciation to the honorable panelists. Your remarks, panelists, were right up to the points, and special thanks to the UN Special Rapporteur, Ms. Alena Dogan. We congratulate you on your appointments on this special and very important post, and wish you every success in your future endeavors. Unfortunately, the topic of our discussion is again continue to be on demand. And again, we are forced to raise the same issue and to raise the attention of the international community of the UCMs. And what is especially peculiar about this meeting is that we can't talk and we can't say that this meeting is that kind of meeting that we are pleased to talk about the subject of this meeting, about the UCMs. Not at all. The UCMs are very negative notion in the international relations, and they are by themselves already devastating instruments which are applied to the contrary of the international law. But what is more horrible is that the UCMs are now continue to be applied in current circumstances and challenges caused by the pandemic. The rationale behind our discussion is clear. Despite international law that prohibits the application of unilateral coercive measures, and in spite of the worldwide enunciation of such policies, these measures and sanctions are still being applied, and we have to admit that. They hinder the access to critical resources of those vulnerable countries, and they hinder the access to the healthcare needed in order to fight against pandemic. And now I will raise a question which I will try to give the answer to as well. So why do some countries and states deserve such an honor? I mean, honor, yes, because we see that some countries are targeted by the UCMs and some are not. So from our point of view and from our perspective, it is absolutely clear that this is because those states take their truly independent stance in their foreign policies. This stance is clearly not to the linking of those, not to the liking of those accustomed to disregard the interests of the others. And therefore, those countries, they respond with coercion and sanctions. And another question is, what can we do in that situation? And from our perspective, we can do two things. First, the countries under unilateral measures and sanctions should never give up. And once they do that, they will never regain their freedom of action. Second, the international community, and especially some multilateral platforms, let's say the non-aligned movements, should firmly stick with their fellow members, with their like-minded countries in these times of trial and distress. And what we would like to emphasize is that governments must cooperate in order to protect the existing supply chains and trade relations. This is very important because trade relations and supply chains influence directly to the supply of critical medical equipment to those vulnerable countries. And we should avoid any discriminatory measures as well in our multilateral trade affairs. It is not the problem of only one country or separate countries. It's not the problem of some regions. It's the problem of all international community. And Belarus faced unilateral coercive measures and sanctions for many years. This is why we fully understand and sympathize with the countries affected, which find themselves in similar circumstances today. We would like to conclude by urging all the like-minded countries to act in unison and to act together and to deliver as one on this matter. And I thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your attention.
I thank you, Mr. Tozik, as well for your statement. I would like now to open the floor for our speakers. I recognize the European Union. The European Union has the floor. Welcome.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidente. I'm Guillaume Dabris. I'm the head of the political section of the European Union. Let me first put my statement in the continuation of the one delivered by the Russian ambassador. In times of COVID-19, which is taking so many lives and disrupting the fabric of our societies, it is more than important that global unity, cooperation, solidarity and compassion prevails in the delivery of humanitarian aid. This is what the European Union is standing up to, and we have, with our global response embodied in the Team Europe package, this is what we've done to show that the European Union stands with those who are, like us, suffering from the COVID-19 pandemics. Let me also briefly address 4 points that are, I think, that will be of great interest in complement to what our panelists said about sanctions. The sanctions, and especially the European Union sanctions, are not meant to stand in the way nor impede the global fight against COVID-19. They are most of the time part of a comprehensive policy aimed at influencing political and security development in some countries. Our sanctions are targeted to those responsible for the policies or actions that the EU wants to influence. And I'm talking proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I'm talking repressive policies of human rights. I'm talking stymieing of democracy, but also global issues like terrorism or cyber attacks. So the EU targeted approach is not a matter of effectiveness, but it also reflects a key principle, and this is my second point. Our sanctions are they do correspond, and they are in accordance with obligations under international law, and in particular the respect for international human rights law, international refugee law, and international and the Security Council resolutions. They do conform with the international right and are therefore legal. Our sanction measures range, our sanction measure regimes range from 30 different situations, and some are indirect transposition of UN Security Council resolution, as I was saying, and some are autonomous. But it's always very specific and always targeted individual measures such as asset freezes or visa bans on designated individuals and entities. And in principles, our sanctions do not include export restrictions such as the prohibition on export of food, medicines, or medical equipment. And in addition, our compliance with international obligations makes our policy of targeted measures contain a system of exceptions. Our exceptions, when appropriate, allow for the provision of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian activities, including medical assistance. And this would allow, for example, designated persons, when talking persons, to intervene in humanitarian activities and cover humanitarian activities not limited to the provision of food and medicine. So I think it was very important to make it clear that the EU sanctions regime do not have any deterrent effect onto the fight against COVID-19. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Madam President.
Well, I have to thank you, the representative of the European Union, and also for strengthening the need for solidarity and compassion in the midst of this, profound multidimensional crisis that we're living in, and also for stressing the fact that sanctions from the European Union do respect international human rights law, and they do not affect provision of food, medicines, and humanitarian actions on the ground. I now would like to give the floor. I'm sorry that I lost the list of speakers right now, but it's the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has the floor. Apologies for the delay. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam President. My name is Mongo Woodyfield, and I'm the Sanctions Coordinator of the United Kingdom Mission to the United Nations. I will be brief, given that I agree very much with what my esteemed colleague from the European Union has just said. And I think it's welcome that you've given us the floor and the chance to explain a little bit our approach to sanctions policy, which is an important way to make this webinar hear both sides, if you like, of this interesting discussion. One thing we all agree on is the absolute importance of international cooperation to combat COVID. And the United Kingdom has given over $900 million to the international effort so far, focusing on reinforcing the resilience of vulnerable countries, vaccines, and supporting the global economy. So it's absolutely right that we think of every single way we can to ensure that all countries in the world and their peoples can tackle this difficult time that we're in. Like my European Union colleague has said, the UK imposes sanctions as a targeted foreign policy tool, part of a comprehensive, broader package. And we always have careful exemptions for humanitarian activity. Some of our speakers today have spoken about some of the UN regimes, and it may be an interesting point to note that on the North Korean regime, for example, we have been very, very active in ensuring that humanitarian exemptions in the last few months have been massively accelerated, so that the WHO, the UN and various agencies are able to get the important resources they need into North Korea to help the North Korean people. And so I want to ask one question for our panelists, which is, when we talk about humanitarian impacts of COVID-19, I think it's really important that we don't overlook the challenges around humanitarian access and the ability of humanitarian actors to get into the countries where people need help. And this is a problem we face in North Korea, and frankly, many of the hosts of today's webinar have situations in which they are controlling the access of humanitarian workers, of UN humanitarian workers, to be able to control the population's ability to get the humanitarian goods that they need. And so I think it's important that when we talk about ensuring humanitarian exemptions for goods, we also think about ensuring humanitarian access so that people can get in, and that isn't politicized in country to stop people who don't agree with the government in which they're living being able to get the care they need. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for a short statement, but also for his question regarding humanitarian support access to our panelists and to the audience in general. Now, I have the honor to give the floor to France. France has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My name is Wadid Benabou. I'm the Deputy Political Coordinator of the French mission, and I totally support the intervention of my colleague from the European delegation, and I very much agree with the intervention of my colleague from the UK mission. I will be short as well. To say first that the fight against COVID-19 is a major challenge that requires solidarity and international cooperation, and that's something we all agree on. That is the reason why France and the EU are fully mobilized in support of the countries in need, in particular in Africa. The EU has committed to a global response package of 20 billion euros to support partner countries' efforts in fighting the pandemic. And France will allocate 1.2 billion euros to the fight against COVID-19 in Africa. That is also the reason why we support the SDG's call for a global ceasefire. When it comes to sanctions, I would not come back in detail on what my colleague from the EU said about the EU sanctions being targeted and allowing for humanitarian exemptions. But I will just take one example, which is the restrictive measures against the Syrian regime. The sanction regime has been put in place in 2011 in response to the deadly repression of the Syrian population by the Syrian regime. And as the repression continues, the sanction regime has been renewed until 2021. The EU sanctions target those responsible for the suffering of the Syrian population, the Syrian regime, their supporters, and business persons who finance the regime. In Syria, the regime has systematically destroyed medical infrastructures since the beginning of the conflict, and it continues to impede humanitarian access. There is no doubt that it bears the primary responsibility for the dire humanitarian situation, which is exacerbated by the pandemic today. European sanctions allow for humanitarian exemptions and do not hamper the response to COVID-19, as explained in the guidance note published by the European Commission last month. And just one word to finish on overcompliance, which is something that has been mentioned several times. We support a continuous dialogue between all parties involved in humanitarian assistance, donors, regulators, NGOs, and banks, to ensure that they can deliver humanitarian aid without hindrance to all the people in need in accordance with humanitarian principles. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, for stressing once again the need for solidarity and more international cooperation to respond to COVID, and also for the support of his country to the call for a global ceasefire. I think that highly needed in times of this pandemic. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to the permanent representative of Algeria to the United Nations. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. Allow me, first of all, to express my sincere thanks to the organizer of this very interesting and timely webinar, as it allows to raise awareness about the negative effects of unilateral coercive measures and the necessity for the international community to act as one. While we are facing a crisis of exceptional magnitude, thank you also to the panelists for their very insightful presentation. Indeed, the issue of unilateral coercive measures remain a major source of concern for the international community because of their devastating impact at the national level and their extraterritorial implication, including on the rights to life, to health, and to food, as well as on the regular access to the maintenance, to the international financial system, or to free trade. Amid the global pandemic of COVID-19, the devastating impact of UCMs on all spheres of life is being further aggravated and multiplied as they seriously affect the ongoing efforts of national governments to fight the pandemic and ensure effective and timely procurement of medical equipment and supply to adequately treat their populations in the face of this pandemic. Under these unprecedented circumstances, immediate and concrete actions are crucial to overcome this complex human crisis and its economic impact, and to guarantee that no one will be left behind. The fight against COVID-19 requires a spirit of mutual respect, multilateralism, solidarity, and cooperation among peoples and states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. This crisis, this unprecedented crisis, calls therefore for the immediate lifting of UCMs in line with the long-standing and principled position of the United Nations to reject such measures in order to ensure effective and efficient response to COVID-19 pandemic. It calls also for strengthening national governments' ability to support and finance the necessary plans and strategies to ensure the containment of the spread of the pandemic. It calls for strengthening the role of regional organization in advocating for and supporting the lifting of UCMs, and it calls for sharing best practice for previous public health crises that could be applied today to address the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, it calls for the raising awareness and promoting multi-stakeholders dialogue on this issue. In this spirit, I would like to address the following questions to the panelists. First, in your view, what types of sanctions have the most negative impact over the enjoyment of human rights in light of COVID-19 pandemic? Second, what are the most urgent measures the international community must undertake to enhance the ability of countries who are currently subjected to UCMs to fight the pandemic? And finally, in line with the increased calls, including by the United Nations officials, for easing sanctions to enable sanctioned countries to fight the pandemic, what concrete steps could be taken to accompany such appeals? And I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I thank the permanent representative of Algeria, Excellency Mr. Sofiane Mimouni, for his statement and for his questions. Unfortunately, we have time constraints, and I really hope that we will be able to respond to your very targeted and concrete questions. So thank you, Excellency. And now I have a request for the floor from South Africa. South Africa has requested the floor, and you have the floor.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We see you and we can hear you. So
Okay.
you have the floor, and you will be our last speaker. I will then ask the panelists if they want to make final comments or statements before we are able to close this webinar. So you are our last speaker today. Please, Madam.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to take the floor, and I'll be very brief. Firstly, I would like to thank the panelists for their insights, very interesting comments that they made. And I would like to also align myself with the statement that was delivered by the DPR of Zimbabwe. And in line with what she was saying, I would also like to reiterate the comments and the position of the African Union and SADC. The chair of the AU, who is the president of South Africa, has strongly highlighted the issue of sanctions and advocating strongly for lifting of these sanctions because of the adverse effects that they have on the affected countries. Much has been said about what those impacts are in Africa and in other parts of the world. So we stand in solidarity with those countries that have been affected by the sanctions. Also, we also look at, in the context of the pandemic, that we are all affected with, that this presented an opportunity for us to lift those sanctions, and unfortunately that has not happened. The Secretary General has called for the waiving of these sanctions. Ms. Bachelet has also called for the waiving of these sanctions. This is not just, they're not just saying it, it's because there is reason for these sanctions to be waived. And I also wanted to highlight the impact that this, particularly when we look at Africa, the reversal of the developmental goals that the African continent have set themselves. This will set back progress that has been achieved already on Agenda 2063 in many respects, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is extremely important that these topics continue to be highlighted. And also had one question. Mr. Sachs mentioned the alternatives that we need to look at, and especially looking at the alternative institutions, and if he can share more light on how to go about it, because we seem to be in a stalemate. How do we begin to start and channel ourselves toward that goal? Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you, South Africa. Thank you also for your questions. I think that you are indeed our last speaker. I see that there is also the request for the floor from the special rapporteur. She's asking to briefly take the floor before we close. So you have the floor, madam. Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. If I may, I would like to respond shortly to the issues which have been touched within our discussion, and I'm very grateful for all the comments, questions, and proposals which have been made during today's webinar. I need to mention on this regard that one of the problems what we face today is that sanctions started to be used so often and by so many actors that we have forgotten that they were initially intended to be a huge exception from the prohibition to use force and the prohibition to intervene, and were initially supposed to be used by the UN Security Council only in response to the threat to peace, breach of peace, and an act of aggression. And therefore, the situation we face now started to be so dichotomized that if we continue to behave like that, we risk to breach the whole system of international relations. COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how deadly sanctions are today, and therefore I believe that these grievance, which started to be really evident, gives us a huge chance to start to communicate to each other in the spirit of solidarity and to start solving the question. And hereby, I will refer to the questions which has been asked by the permanent representative of Algeria, which are basically very aligned with the questions which stay in my questionnaire sent to all the missions of all states and basically sent to the attention of the civil society. But as I may see from and I will be grateful for the responses on this regard, but as I may see from the responses already achieved, in the course of the pandemic, the most heavy and dangerous effect can be calculated to the economic, financial embargoes that impact the economy of the countries most of all, and moreover, it impacts the ability of countries to buy medical medicine, medical staff, supplies, food, and other means necessary for the survival of the population. If we speak about the responses, we need to differentiate between the responses in the course of pandemic, so short-term responses and the long-term responses. As it was rightly noted during the webinar, the short-term response shall be done without any prejudice to the legality of unilateral sanctions, which are done by different states. And therefore, when we speak about the short-term responses, all humanitarian exceptions are very useful. Humanitarian aid is very necessary. But I believe that the best way is to lift or suspend sanctions now to help the countries which are targeted, to help their population. If we speak about the humanitarian exceptions, the very important aspect is to make them very clear, transparent, and easy to be used, because quite often they are quite complicated. When we speak about the long-term responses, there is a clear need to re-establish the legal framework which regulate the functioning of single states in the international relations, based on the principles of legality, solidarity, non-discrimination, cooperation, and the respect to the rule of law. And on this regard, I believe it's necessary to use all legal means. And by doing so, I do not refer only to the ones which has been mentioned, but I may propose, for example, the mechanisms which help to protect the rights of individuals, via, for example, individual communications within special procedures, which hasn't been used by mandate before, but it can be used as well. So hereby, I would thank all of you for for your inputs, and I hope very much for future cooperation on solving the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duhan, for remarks. And now, if you allow me, we are going to move to the closing session of this webinar. And I would like to give the floor to the permanent representative of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Zhang Jun, to deliver some brief closing remarks. So, I see Professor Sachs on screen. He's requesting the floor. And of course, you have the floor, Professor Sachs, and then we will go to the closing statement from China, from Cuba, and from Syria. So you have the floor, Professor Sachs.
Thank you very much. I'll be very, very brief. Which sanctions are the worst? The U.S. sanctions, because they are the extraterritorial sanctions that leverage the role of the dollar into a global sanction, even though it's a sanction by one country. This is really the essence of what we're talking about today, because the US discovered that it could determine the whole world's policies unilaterally. This is extraordinary. And the US administration is very vicious, and it is using this prerogative of deciding unilaterally, even against the will of the world, and thereby stopping the whole world from doing business. But basically, it is a bluff. Please understand this is a bluff, because it is not hard to construct means to trade through entities that are not subject to US sanction. Create special entities and really let them operate. I just saw the Reuters announcement this moment that Venezuela's oil exports are at the lowest level since 2003 because of the stranglehold of the United States. Well, buy Venezuelan oil through an entity that doesn't use US banks and doesn't care about the US market. Create a special entity, and then it will be possible to make a workaround against this unilateral sanction. This is really the story. Don't beg. I mean, it's fine, by the way, calling them illegal and all the rest. I couldn't agree more. But don't think Trump is going to change. He's not going to change. Understand what he is: vicious, unilateral, and not really caring even about American lives, much less the lives of the people in other countries. So you have to create your own entities. And the EU has started this with Instex, but it should really step up and be serious about Instex. And Russia and China and others can do the same. And it's just a practical workaround from the US. Don't let the US dictate global policy. That's, I think, the beginning and almost the end of it. It's not the full end of it, but it's the practical end of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. As always, very thought-provoking, very, very sharp. So thank you for your closing statement, Professor Sachs. And now, indeed, we will move to the closing session. And I have the privilege representative of the People's of China to the United Nations, Excellency Mr. Zhang Jun, to deliver some brief closing remarks. You have the floor, Excellency.
Honorable Madam President, my dear friends, Excellencies, dear experts, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure and honor to gather with you online for this discussion on the impact of unilateral coercive measures on the global fight against the COVID-19. I have listened very carefully what you have said. I agree with the ambassadors and experts who spoke before me. I have also listened very carefully to the remarks of other participants. This webinar will once again send a strong message to the world against the unilateral coercive measures for the maintenance of the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter and solidarity and cooperation in fighting the pandemic. After 75 years of vicissitudes, the UN Charter remains a cornerstone in maintaining world peace and stability. A small number of countries, such as the United States, in total disregard of the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter and the norms of international law, wantonly take unilateral coercive measures like economic embargo, financial sanctions against other countries, which seriously undermine the sovereignty of the sanctions countries and the legitimate rights and the interests of entities and individuals within their jurisdiction. Such practice is utterly illegitimate. UCMs run counter to multilateralism and the basic norms of international relations. Over the years, UCMs have undermined the sanctions countries' ability to mobilize resources, develop the economy, and improve people's living standards, making innocent civilians the biggest victims. We express deep sympathies to the sufferings of Cuba and other countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, as well as in other parts of the world, and support the country's actions to uphold their legitimate rights and interests. The spread of COVID-19 is posing enormous threats to people's lives and health and severe challenges to global public health security and wreaking havoc with the world's economic and social development. Facing this unprecedented human crisis, some countries still insist on unilateral coercive measures, which only make things even worse. UCMs severely disrupt the already fragile global trade and supply chains and impede the transportation and provision of medical and anti-epidemic supplies, making it difficult for sanctions countries to curb the disease. This endangers the lives of so many and will delay the final victory of the global fight against the pandemic. UCMs severely weaken the vulnerable countries' ability to respond, making it impossible for them to effectively ease the economic and social impacts of the pandemic. The basic rights and interests of the vulnerable groups, such as women, children, the elderly, the persons with disabilities, will be undermined even more. UCMs also seriously hinder the post-pandemic recovery and the development of sanctioned countries. It will further aggravate poverty, hunger, and inequalities, and may cause irreparable losses to the global implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as the cause of development. The United States goes further by using unilateral power to suppress foreign companies, sabotages international cooperation on science and technology, and abuses long-arm jurisdiction. Such acts of bullying have further violated other countries' rights of self-development, seriously undermined the world economy, and triggered a series of negative consequences. Solidarity and cooperation is the most powerful weapon in fighting COVID-19. All members of the international community should respond positively to Secretary General Guterres' appeals, make every effort to tackle the impact of unilateral coercive measures, and help sanctioned countries to overcome the difficulties. I have listened very carefully the ideas, proposals laid out by dear colleagues and experts. I wish to emphasize the following. First, we should urge the relevant countries to immediately lift unilateral coercive measures and work with the international community to fight the pandemic and get through this difficult time. We must fully listen to the people of the sanctioned countries, take concrete actions to protect their health and rights, and leave no country behind. Second, the UN and other international organizations should provide sanctioned countries with timely and effectively support to help them address the economic and social impact of the pandemic and ease the difficulties facing the people to prevent humanitarian disasters. China is among the first to act and has provided a large amount of assistance to countries in need, and we will continue to do so. Third, the UN General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Human Rights Council, and other agencies and bodies should take necessary steps, make a strong voice, and explore solutions from different angles to fundamentally eliminate the impact of unilateral coercive measures. Fourth, we should jointly practice multilateralism, firmly uphold the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter, resolutely oppose hegemonism, power politics, and bullying practice, and create a favorable international environment for countries to win the fight against the disease and achieve rapid recovery and sustainable development. No country will succeed in making itself great by trying to stop the development of others. We have only one world, and people have a shared future. Although we are more physically apart due to the virus, our hearts are more closely interconnected. To make our world a better place, we must help each other and work together for a brighter future shared by all. I thank you, Madam President. I thank you all, dear colleagues.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the permanent representative of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations, for your 4 points and for also your call for the lifting of the UCMs, especially to allow countries to face this catastrophic scenario of the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, China has demonstrated with actions how international cooperation and solidarity has to work. So, and also thank you for your pledge to strengthen our multilateral system and to uphold the principles of the UN Charter. So thank you very much. And now I have the privilege to give the floor to Her Excellency Ana Silvia Rodriguez, Deputy Permanent Representative of Cuba to the United Nations, to take the floor. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to see you. We highly value the support and wide interest expressed by many participants on the theme for this webinar. For me, it's very difficult to add much to our dialogue after many substantive interventions by previous speakers. I will try to be brief and focus my intervention on the relevance of the main theme of this meeting, particularly in the light of the upcoming 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Cuba strongly believes in multilateralism and international cooperation in today's world as the only possible way to promote common goals and find solutions to our collective problems, including our difference. That implies the need to fully uphold the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law, which are very often the only defense for the most vulnerable among us to stand on equal footing at the global stage. The current pandemic has exposed to the international public opinion, like never before, the grave impact these measures have always had on the affected countries, amplifying the global call to urgently lift them and empowering the wider part of the international community, including the UN system, to pursue a reinvigorated multilateralism and solidarity in our collective response to ensure that no country and no one is left behind. Unilateral coercive measures are not just a gross violation of the UN Charter and international law, but also to the spirit that guided the foundation of the United Nations 75 years ago, as was clearly exposed today. Furthermore, these measures affect the promotion and full enjoyment of all human rights. There cannot be a defense of the principle of the international law and the Charter of the United Nations if, at the same time, member states undermine the respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of states, the self-determination of peoples, the equality of states and peoples, the rejection and of interference in the internal affairs of other states, all of them core values of the United Nations. UCM are exactly the opposite of multilateralism, solidarity, and international cooperation. Since this pandemic hit Cuba, the US government has done nothing to address the urgent call made by the international community, and the least to alleviate the blockade imposed now for almost 60 years on my people. Cuba continues to believe that only together, through multilateralism and international cooperation, and from a non-politicized approach, will humanity be able to tackle this or any other pandemic and global challenge. Overcoming the wide impact of the US blockade on our people and economy, Cuba has sent over 27 brigades with over 2,400 healthcare personnel to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and including Europe to help in the fight of COVID-19. Without the blockade, Cuba could be in a position to do much more to help others in need. In light of all the above, is that we are very thankful for the celebration and deliberation of today's webinar and believe it to be one of the utmost relevance. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I have to thank you, Excellency Ambassador Rodriguez, for your remarks and for reminding us that after 75 years, UCM precisely contradict the very principles of multilateralism and the founding principles of the organization and the UN Charter, and they really hurt and harm the enjoyment of all human rights. And let me also express our acknowledge and recognition of this a display of true solidarity from Cuba of the blockade. So make sure that doctors and nurses from Cuba, are sent to the places, regardless of continent, of size and power of the countries, to the places where they are needed the most. So thank you for this a well-known Cuban solidarity, Ambassador. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Jahafari, the permanent representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to the United Nations. Excellency Bashar Jahafari, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, my dear friend, Maria Fernanda Espinosa. It is such an honor and pleasure for me personally to see you chairing this very important meeting today. Madam Chair, I want to thank all the distinguished speakers for their active and constructive participation in this important webinar. For the sake of the time allotted for the meeting, let me highlight some key elements and remarks, closing remarks, as you have rightly pointed out. We all agreed that the pandemic of COVID-19 and its impacts poses a global humanitarian, economic, and social challenge that transcends the boundaries of the current time stage with all its tragedies and difficulties. There is no doubt that the continued imposition of unilateral coercive measures is one of the serious gaps in building global collective measures in one of the serious on two basic steps. Is one of the serious gaps in building global collective solidarity, which should be based on two basic steps. First is strengthening the capabilities of all countries equally and without exception. And second is activating the tools of multilateral preventive diplomacy. In the face of unfolding COVID-19 pandemic emergency, many statements and appeals have been issued by United Nations senior officials and groups and forums, led by the UN Secretary General, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur, Mrs. Duan, the Group of 77 and China, the Non-Aligned Movement, more than 44 UN organizations and international bodies, all of which have urged for lifting unilateral sanctions that obstruct the humanitarian responses of sanctioned states in order to enable their health care systems to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and save lives, and alarming the international community that these coercive measures impede and undermine the essential cooperation and solidarity that should prevail among nations. Unfortunately, instead of taking immediate measures to lift or at least suspend coercive measures on the Syrian people, the EU decided to prolong its restrictive measures until June 1st, 2021. And the US President sent a letter to the Congress announcing that he is renewing also US sanctions against Syrian people. In addition to imposing new and tightening the already imposed sanctions on the Syrian people by activating what's so-called Caesar Act, which will come into effect in the current June, as you know. Let me just affirm here the fact that all recent US and EU statements and fact sheets regarding alleged exemptions and exceptions for humanitarian assistance and trade in order to reduce the profound impact of these illegal punitive measures on the Syrian people and on the peoples of other countries are merely irresponsible and misleading attempt to cover up the crimes and violations of these parties against the sovereignty, independence, safety, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. and against the security, peace, stability, and prosperity of the Syrian people. Having said that, our colleagues from the EU perfectly know that the Syrian banking system is fully blocked from any foreign transactions because of EU and US illegal sanctions. And they perfectly know that the EU banks have put their hands on Syrian assets, which were dedicated to bring food and medicines to Syria. And they perfectly know that we cannot rebuild our electricity power stations, which were destroyed by Daesh and Al-Qaeda because of the EU and the US sanctions. They are doing in Syria exactly what they are doing to Venezuela. I did not want this important session to turn into confrontation with other participants. The facts are clear, and I would only tell our colleague from France, for instance, that his government was and still involved in supporting terrorism and destruction in my country, Syria. So they lost any legal and moral qualification to speak or evaluate the situation in my country, or desperately try to find baseless legal framework for EU sanctions on the Syrian people. I have sent, during the past 3 months, more than 10 letters on behalf of my government to the Secretary General, the President of the General Assembly, and the President of the Security Council, in which I explained the profound impact of these unilateral sanctions on the life of every Syrian citizen inside Syria. I included in those letters evidence and statistics proving that these sanctions affect all economic, agricultural, industrial, banking, investment, and service sectors in Syria, in parallel to imposing economic terrorism. This is how we call it. This is how we qualify it. It's an economic terrorism on any foreign party trying to enter Syria to contribute to the reconstruction and early recovery process. I would like to remind your good self here of the systematic policy pursued by the United States and the European Union of preventing the United Nations Development System, UNDP, from launching the reconstruction process in Syria after a decade-long terrorist war. In conclusion, Madam Chair, we will continue to advocate the rights and aspirations of the Syrian people and the peoples of many countries of the world who's exceeded 2 billion and are subject to these illegal measures, along with the support of the distinguished UN officials and activists like the respected speakers who enriched our discussion today. I am confident that placing a priority on the profound impacts of these coercive measures on the global fight against COVID-19 will alert the international community to the fact that the failure to achieve global collective solidarity will raise justified doubts about the effectiveness or even the existence of a global multilateral system, and about the capability of the United Nations system of putting an end to such unlawful embargo or limiting its profound effects on the peoples of the world and on sustainable development. I thank you very much, Madam Chair.
I thank you, Hafari, for your remarks and for your call to the need to deploy multilateral preventive diplomacy to respect international law and to strengthen our multilateral system, and for just sharing with us how much the Syrian people are suffering in the midst of this pandemic because of UCMs. Thank you, Ambassador. I think that brings us to the end of this webinar. My apologies to the several questions and requests for the floor that we have had to omit because of the lack of time. This is only, a sign that there is a need for more discussion and conversation. I think that we are going to display in the screen the survey summary of today. In the midst of a pandemic, should sanctions be lifted? Yes, yes, and how much percent? It's hard to read, but no, 3%, and yes, I think 36%. I mean, you can read by yourselves the result of our survey today, so that you have that in front of your respective screens. And now I think that we can say that we have reached the end of this webinar. I would like to close by thanking again the co-hosts of this event, to thank all our dream team of panelists. I apologize because several of them wanted to take the floor again for closing remarks and to respond to the questions, but time, unfortunately, does not allow us to take this conversation further, but I'm sure that we will have more opportunities to reflect and act on how to address unilateral coercive measures, especially in the midst of this pandemic and the COVID-19 crisis. I think that we have heard from our speakers a list of alternatives and options for the need, from the need to strengthen the multilateral system, to fully use the tools that we have in the multilateral architecture, from the International Court of Justice to the Uniting for Peace resolution, to bring the issue to the discussion of the General Assembly, greater diplomatic work at the UN, but certainly the need to have a stronger, robust multilateral system. And of course, some questions on the table to address the issue of extraterritoriality in the application of the UCMs, the alternatives to de-dollarize international trade, and other options that were put on the table today. But I think that the words that we heard the most today is the need for greater international cooperation and solidarity in responding to this COVID crisis, and the respect for international law and international human rights law, that I think was a common thread today as well. Several of the speakers today mentioned the need for a UN declaration on UCMs. So work needs to continue, your engagement needs to continue, and certainly there is a need for more space and time to continue this discussion and conversation. Once again, thank you for also for staying 1 hour beyond the time that was allocated for this webinar. Thank you for your contributions, for your participation, and once again, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to moderate this webinar. So thank you very, very much, and have a good rest of the week.